The story begins with a mother reflecting on her son George, a boy who has always had a knack for attracting the strangest friends. She isn't sure why, but even in his early years, George seemed to gravitate toward the kids others might call weird. She has countless stories about his unusual friendships, but one incident in particular stands out like a thorn in her memory. It happened when George was in the 4th grade, shortly after the family had moved due to her husband's job reassignment. George was the new kid at school, but his outgoing and friendly nature made the transition seem smooth. He had always been a social butterfly, so his parents weren't worried about him making friends. The move had gone well for the family, and George seemed to be thriving at his new school. The mother was relieved when she met the parents of George's classmates. They all seemed like upstanding, honest people. For a while, everything felt normal. But then, a few months after the move, the phone rang in the middle of the day. It was George's school, asking one of his parents to come in to discuss an incident involving George and another student. Her husband was at work, so she took on the responsibility. As she drove to the school, her mind raced with a mix of anger and confusion. Anger because her son had likely been in a fight, and if he was the instigator, she'd have to punish him. But confusion too because physical altercations were completely out of character for George. He wasn't the type to lash out without reason. The thought of him being involved in something like this was deeply unsettling. When she arrived at the school, she picked up George from his classroom. He was unusually quiet, refusing to answer any of her questions about what had happened. This silence was unlike him. George was usually an oversharer, the kind of kid who would tell you every detail of his day without prompting. His refusal to talk made her stomach churn. She figured he was either embarrassed or scared, so she didn't push him too hard. The principal asked George to wait outside the office while they spoke. She left him there, sitting on a bench, his small hands fidgeting in his lap. Inside the principal's office, she sat down in front of his desk, her heart pounding. The principal began by asking her questions about George's behavior at home. Was he respectful? Did he listen? Did he ever act out? She answered honestly, praising George for being a well-behaved and respectful boy. This wasn't just a mother's bias, it was the truth. George was a good kid. The principal nodded, then explained why she had been called in. Apparently, George had gotten into a brief altercation with a classmate after recess, a boy named Sebastian. The details were sparse, but the principal said that George had pulled an eraser out of his pocket and struck Sebastian over the head with it, causing him to fall to the ground and start screaming. The mother was baffled. This didn't sound like George at all. He wasn't the type to attack someone without provocation. Plus, she had heard George talk about Sebastian before. He spoke fondly of him, like they were close friends. She pressed the principal for more information, but he admitted that no one had actually seen the incident. Both boys had independently confirmed the details of the story, though, so the school had no reason to doubt it. The principal assured her that George wasn't in trouble. Small fights weren't uncommon at this age, but he wanted to inform her and make sure she was aware of what had happened. This calmed her down a little, but the confusion lingered. Why would George do something like that? When she left the office, George was still sitting on the bench, his head down. She took him home, but he remained silent the entire drive. It wasn't until bedtime, after hours of her growing frustration with his refusal to talk, that he finally opened up. He told her that Sebastian had tricked him. They had been playing make-believe Street Fighter, as per Sebastian's instruction, and George had pulled out the eraser as part of a KO move. Out of nowhere, Sebastian fell to the ground and pretended to be seriously hurt. Then, he whispered in George's ear that if George didn't pretend like he had attacked him, Sebastian would seriously hurt him. Terrified, George went along with it, and the teachers assumed it was a real fight. The mother was furious. Her little boy had been manipulated and falsely accused. She decided to handle the situation herself rather than going back to the school. That night, she dug through the school directory and found Sebastian's mother's phone number. When she called, a woman named Maggie answered. Maggie sounded sweet and genuine, and she immediately apologized for the incident. She said Sebastian had already told her the truth and that she had reprimanded him. The mother found it odd that Sebastian had confessed so quickly, but she was relieved she didn't have to argue her case. Maggie went on to explain that Sebastian had always struggled with behavioral issues. He sometimes acted like a completely different person, as if he wasn't fully in control of his actions. The more Maggie spoke, the more the mother's anger softened into pity. It sounded like Sebastian was dealing with something much bigger than just being a difficult kid. Maggie suggested that the boys have a sleepover to make up for the incident and become better friends. The mother thought it was a good idea, and Maggie offered to host. That weekend, she drove George to Maggie's house. George was back to his usual bubbly self, chatting excitedly about the sleepover. Maggie welcomed them warmly, and the two mothers spent the evening getting to know each other over a glass of wine while the boys played in the basement. Maggie seemed like a completely upstanding person, and the mother found herself enjoying her company. Hours flew by, and eventually, the conversation turned to Sebastian's behavior. Maggie's demeanor changed, her voice lowering as she admitted that Sebastian had seen several doctors, some of whom thought he might have multiple personality disorder. She assured the mother that Sebastian was getting better and that he didn't have a history of violence, just strange behavior. The mother felt reassured, and it was comforting to think that George might be helping Sebastian learn how to make friends. When it was time to leave, she went downstairs to say goodbye to George. The boys were laughing and playing Battleship, clearly getting along. She kissed George goodbye and drove home, feeling optimistic about the sleepover. The next morning, she returned to pick him up. George was waiting by the door with his things, a smile on his face. She assumed the night had gone well. But as they drove away, George suddenly burst into tears. Alarmed, she asked him what was wrong. What he told her next left her speechless. George said everything had been fine until bedtime. The boys had set up their sleeping arrangements in the basement, 2 air mattresses side by side. They went to bed like normal, but in the middle of the night George woke up. At first he wasn't sure why, but then he heard something, a faint whispering coming from the bathroom. The door was slightly open, and inside, there was a strange flickering light like a candle. George listened closer and realized it was Sebastian talking. But it wasn't just talking, he was having a full conversation. The weirdest part was that Sebastian wasn't calling himself Sebastian. He was calling himself Mr. Jim. George froze. It was like Sebastian thought he was someone else and he wasn't talking to anyone, just the mirror. Then, the candle went out, and everything went dark. George squeezed his eyes shut, pretending to be asleep. A long time passed, and then he heard the bathroom door creak open. His stomach dropped as the whispering started again, this time right above him. It went on for what felt like forever, the words incomprehensible, not even sounding like English. George lay there, too scared to move, until eventually, Sebastian went back to bed like nothing had happened. In the morning, Sebastian was completely normal again. George didn't dare ask him about it. When George finished his story, the mother was horrified. Her gut told her this wasn't just a case of childhood imagination. Something was very wrong. She didn't know what to do, but she knew she had to tell someone. She called Maggie, who at first laughed it off, saying Sebastian had always been a creative kid. But as the mother pressed her, Maggie's voice faltered. She finally admitted that Sebastian's behavioral issues were more serious than she had let on. One psychiatrist had even suggested he was showing signs of multiple personality disorder. They had already moved twice before because Sebastian had been kicked out of school. The mother was stunned and furious. Why hadn't Maggie told her this before? Why would she put George in danger like that? Then Maggie did something unexpected. She begged the mother not to notify the school. The mother didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to respect Maggie's wishes, but another part knew something was very wrong. She blurted out, "Okay," and hung up the phone before Maggie could respond. She told herself she'd make a decision by the end of the week, but she never got the chance. That Monday, Sebastian attacked another student at recess. It was serious enough that the school sent out a statement to all the parents, though the details were vague. By the end of the day, the mother found out Sebastian had been expelled. She tried calling Maggie, but her phone had been disconnected. The situation was incredibly unsettling. Just days ago they had spoken, and now suddenly Maggie was unreachable. There were no other numbers or emails in the school directory, just that one disconnected number. A few days later, the curiosity became too much. The mother drove to Maggie's house only to find it completely vacated. No moving trucks, no sign of a rushed departure, just gone. It didn't make sense. How could they have left so quickly? She tried looking them up online but found nothing. No forwarding address, no trace of them anywhere. It was like they had never existed at all. Years have passed since then, and George seems to have mostly forgotten about the incident. But the mother hasn't. She often thinks about what could have happened to her son that night in the basement, or what kind of things Sebastian has been doing since. Her upbringing was a little unorthodox. She grew up in a Southern Baptist household, the kind where they didn't believe in ghosts but were absolutely certain about demons. If something strange happened, it wasn't a spirit or a wandering soul. It was something darker, something biblical. She never fully bought into it, but the message was drilled into her from a young age. Rejecting demons meant rejecting Scripture itself. Her mother, though, was different. Faith was optional for her. She wasn't atheist or agnostic, just indifferent. She'd say things like, "God and I have an understanding," whenever pressed about church. While the mother leaned into religion as a source of structure and stability, her mother drifted further from it. This was just one of the many things that widened the gap between them. The mother won't sugarcoat it. Her mother struggled with addiction and mental health issues, things she never wanted help for. Some days, she was functional. Others, she was downright insane. Looking back, the mother realizes her mother likely had schizophrenia or some kind of adjacent condition. But back then, mental health wasn't discussed the way it is now. One afternoon, the mother had a nightmare so vivid that she still remembers every detail. In the dream, she was lying in bed when her mother stormed into her room, screaming in a fit of rage. She grabbed her daughter by the wrist and started shaking her violently. The mother woke up in a pool of sweat, her body rigid with fear. But before she could shake off the dream, it happened again. Except this time, she wasn't asleep. The door barged open, and there her mother was just as she had been in the nightmare. Same expression, same unhinged anger, same words. It was like the dream had been some kind of prophecy. The mother barely managed to push her off and yell for her to stop. Then, it was over. Her mother left as suddenly as she had entered. When the mother confronted her the next morning, she had no memory of it. She seemed confused, even a little hurt that her daughter was so shaken. The mother told herself it was a coincidence, some bizarre overlap between her subconscious and her mother's moods. But part of her wondered if it was something worse. A few weeks later, she heard her mother screaming from the backyard. It wasn't a panicked scream or even a distressed one. It sounded more excited, if that makes sense. She rushed outside and froze at what she saw. Her mother was standing in the yard, grinning, holding a massive 7-foot-long snake in her bare hands. This was terrifying enough on its own, but there's something you need to know that made it even worse. Her mother had a lifelong phobia of snakes. She couldn't even look at them on TV without recoiling. But there she was, gripping one like it was a toy. She motioned for her daughter to come closer, saying, "Come here," as if offering the snake to her. The mother took a step back, shaking her head. She literally said, "Mom, what the hell?" But the look in her mother's eye told her she couldn't even understand the words. She just smiled wider and tilted her head like she was trying to scare her. The mother couldn't deal with it. She turned and ran back inside, slamming the door behind her. Her heart was pounding as she peeked out the window and saw her mother still standing there, holding the snake like an offering. Eventually, she let it slither onto the ground and walked back inside as if nothing had happened. Later, when the mother asked her about it, she shrugged, saying, "You must have had a strange dream," and refused to entertain any further questions. That was nothing compared to what happened that winter, though. The mother's church held an overnight lock-in, and she was relieved to go. Church was her escape, a place where she could be around predictable, normal people. Her mother dropped her off, completely sober, and even kissed her forehead before driving away. At around 4:30 a.m., just as everyone was settling into sleep, a loud knocking echoed through the chapel. They all sat up, glancing at each other. The knocking moved, traveling around the building in an impossible way. At times it sounded like it was coming from multiple directions at once. It wasn't the wind and it wasn't an animal. It was rhythmic, circling the chapel like someone or something was trying to break in. The pastor, the only one with a key, was asleep in his office and hadn't heard a thing. The mother ran to wake him, and as soon as he stepped into the chapel, the knocking stopped. He opened the front doors and literally stumbled back in fear. Standing there, barefoot and sweating in the freezing air, was her mother. Her clothes were disheveled, her hair dripping with sweat. Her lips were moving, but the mother couldn't hear what she was saying. She didn't acknowledge the pastor. Her eyes locked on her daughter immediately. A slow, unsettling smile stretched across her face as she walked toward her. The mother wanted to run, but the pastor tried to hold her back, whispering, "Stay here." She felt completely powerless, like she had no choice but to go with her. She climbed into the car, afraid that her mother was going to do something, but she didn't. The drive home was silent. Her mother didn't speak, didn't explain, didn't answer when asked why she was there. When they got home, she stopped in the doorway and just stared at her daughter as she walked to her room. The mother closed the door, locked it, and lay awake for hours listening. In the morning, her mother was in the kitchen cooking breakfast. She was cheerful and clearly oblivious to what had happened the night before. She jumped back when she saw her daughter saying, "I was just about to pick you up from the church." The mother felt the blood drain from her face. Her mother had no memory of knocking on the church doors, no memory of driving her home. It was freaky. She expected someone, the pastor, a church elder, even one of the chaperones, to say something about what had happened, but no one did. It was like they didn't know what to make of it, or worse, they didn't want to. That was decades ago. Her mother is gone now, but her memory is something that will never leave her, for better or for worse. The mother doesn't know if she believes in demons or the supernatural anymore, but she can't explain what happened. The logical explanation is that her mother was suffering from mental illness, maybe addiction, withdrawal, or something else entirely. But the memory lapses, the eerie timing, the way she acted like a different person some nights, it still haunts her. She tells herself there's a rational answer for all of it, but even now she's not sure she believes that. Years later, her eldest son started sleepwalking when he was about 8 or 9. She had heard of kids going through phases like that, so she wasn't too concerned at first. It was just one of those things. A little unsettling, sure, but nothing she thought much about. She's a pretty light sleeper, so none of her kids have ever been able to sneak around the house at night without her knowing. That's actually how she first figured out about her son's habit. Most nights she'd wake up and find him standing in the hallway outside her bedroom, walking slightly on his heels, shifting his weight from foot to foot. His eyes would be open, but they weren't seeing anything. That was the one part that always got her. For anyone who has lived with a sleepwalker, you know exactly what she's talking about. His gaze would pass right through her, empty and distant, like he was looking past her into something she couldn't see. It was always extremely strange, and she never fully acclimated to finding him like that. Sometimes he'd mumble something, under his breath, words too soft and slurred to understand. Other times he wouldn't make a sound, just standing there, breathing in that slow, steady way that somehow made it even worse. She'd gently guide him back to bed, whispering his name, telling him everything was fine. He never seemed to remember any of it in the morning. Things escalated a few months after she made the realization that he was a sleepwalker. One night, she woke up to a rhythmic tapping sound. It sounded like water droplets repeatedly dripping onto a window pane. Only it wasn't raining outside. It was soft, barely loud enough to wake her at first,